right in. So my overall thesis is that I think you can make more sense of what's been happening on the global stage since Trump came back into office if you view the U.S. government as throwing a Hail Mary pass, right? That what they're doing is unlikely to succeed, but you can understand why they feel they have no choice, given how much time is left on the clock in the game and what the scoreboard is showing. They got to throw a Hail Mary pass, right? So if you just think about that for a second, is a Hail Mary pass likely to result in a touchdown? No, but that doesn't mean it's a dumb thing to do, right? It'd be a dumb thing to do your first possession in a game. And say, what do that for? But if, again, you got 8 seconds left and it's fourth down and, you're down by 5 points, okay, then it might make sense. Okay, so that's my claim. A historical analogy that occurs to me is the Japanese government attacking Pearl Harbor, right? That, in one sense, that was dumb. You awaken the sleeping giant. Now you're really going to lose the war. You bring the U.S. into it. What are you doing? But on the other hand, if you get into it and look at some of the internal deliberations among Japanese military planners and whatnot, the U.S. government certainly was not being neutral and just trying to stay out of the war. They were clearly, helping the British and doing various things that were choking off the Japanese, such that I think the Japanese realized this can continue. If we just continue with our current policy and we don't do something against the U.S., we're going to lose for sure. If we do a quick strike and knock out their Navy or a big chunk of it and keep them on the sidelines where they really can't interfere, maybe we can get this thing wrapped up before the U.S. can recover from a surprise attack. All right, so I think that was the idea. Now, in practice, it didn't work, but it wasn't as crazy a move as it might seem. Certainly, the way FDR explained it to the American people at the time, we're minding our own business in this, unprovoked day that will live in infamy, attack, that what the Japanese were doing made more sense once you understood the situation they found themselves in. Again, doesn't mean it was the correct thing for them to do. It certainly wasn't moral, right? They shouldn't have been in that situation in the first place, but you get the point I'm trying to make. Okay, so I'm not going to keep belaboring what I'm doing here in the mindset, but I want to say likewise, just as it would have been just doing a disservice, and there's no point in studying this stuff if you're not going to try to understand why people are doing what they're doing, to look at the Japanese and just say, they were just reckless and dumb and bloodthirsty, I guess. They just liked attacking people for no reason. Well, they picked the wrong person to mess with on that date, huh? Likewise, I've seen some people just saying, Trump and his advisor are just a bunch of buffoons and they have no clue what they're doing. And they're just, and I think you're missing what's going on. Okay. Again, that doesn't mean, this is the last disclaimer I'll make, and then I'll get into the content. I just want to be clear. I don't want to lose people up front. It doesn't mean that what they're doing is going to work or that it even makes sense on their own terms. Just like attacking Pearl Harbor in retrospect was a really bad idea from the Japanese point of view. But nonetheless, you can understand why they might have thought that was their only option. Likewise here, as I go through some of this stuff, I think you may gain more appreciation for, that's why the U.S. government has been doing what it's been doing the last year. Okay. So first of all, the big picture is, and I'm going to go ahead and just give you some pieces of evidence to make this case, is that I think if there were a group of people who liked the U.S. being by far the global superpower, that they realized as current trends continue and unfold here, we are going to lose that status pretty soon. And so they had to take rapid action, and I think realized our last shot at this is now we've got Donald Trump in the White House, a sympathetic ear to our point of view. And so we need to do it right now, because if we wait, it's going to be too late. Right? I think that's the overarching motivation or mindset. And so let me go ahead and give you some evidence for that as to why China is going to be unstoppable if action isn't taken in the near future. Again, I don't think like this. I'm a pacifist, right? And also, I'm not saying China poses a threat in the sense that, yes, you need the U.S. and Israel and the U.K. or whoever to stand up to China. Otherwise, they're going to bulldoze everybody. No, I think, classical liberalism, the ideas advanced by Ludwig von Mises, that would have been better. And if the U.S. government and the Europeans and more governments around the world followed the type of advice that Mises laid out in his works on classical liberalism, or better yet, if every nation, meaning like the peoples, read Rothbard's For a New Liberty and they all became anarcho-capitalists, that'd be even better. But in any event, that isn't what happened. And so let's just walk through how this could have been perceived by people of the mindset that it's really important that we maintain U.S. hegemony. Okay, so just basic fact of raw economic output, that the Chinese economy arguably has been bigger than the U.S. economy since 2014. All right, so when you here, I'll spend a bit of time on this point just to make sure you're getting your economic theory fix from this episode, because after all, the Human Action Podcast is supposed to be about economics. When you're asking, hey, there's two countries, which one has the bigger economy? So one thing is you got to figure out, well, how are you going to measure something like that? So let's use GDP. Bunch of problems with that, even given one country, and you're going to just take its money for granted. But there's an extra problem when you say, just not worry about the problems of measuring output with GDP. Let's just say GDP is what it is. And then you want to say, okay, the U.S. has its GDP measured in U.S. dollars. China has its GDP measured in yuan. And so how do you compare those two? And so there's two main ways that economists use to put them on an equal footing. And so the more obvious, straightforward approach is just to say, well, you go to the Forex markets where U.S. dollars are traded against Chinese yuan, and you just see what's the exchange rate. And then whatever that is, that's how you convert from one currency to the other, right? Just like if you were buying barrels of oil or you were doing some other sort of financial transaction where the currencies changed hands and you needed to price the thing in a common unit, you would just use market exchange rates. Of course you would. And so using that approach, the U.S. still has the largest economy in the world, and China's number 2. And specifically, with that approach, the U.S. is about 1.5 times the size of China right now. Okay. However, it's not obvious that that really is the best metric if what you're really trying to establish is the output of the entire country. If somehow you had to quantify that economically, how does that compare to the output of this other giant country? Okay, because where the market exchange rate is clearly the appropriate conversion rate is if we're talking about goods that can be traded internationally. Because, if some other country, Great Britain wants to import goods from the U.S. or from China, and they're trying to figure out which country do we want to buy from, clearly the foreign exchange rate between dollars and yuan is the relevant thing to figure out. Like, I want to buy some electronic goods or something, and I need to compare the prices to put it on a common footing. You do that, clearly. But there are a lot of goods and services that can't be shipped internationally. All right. So if like haircuts, if for some reason, like if you looked at the local price of a haircut measured in yuan in China, and then using market exchange rates, it was like, oh, that's cheaper than a haircut of comparable quality in Boise, Idaho. So you said, well, so how come somebody doesn't just import the haircut from China and deliver it and undercut the haircutters in Boise? And the answer is because you can't ship a haircut, right? So there's plenty of stuff like that where standard arguments about arbitrage, in which, yes, for sure, the market exchange rate would be the correct way to put everything on an equal footing, doesn't apply. All right. And so an alternate measure is what's called purchasing power parity, or PPP, that you may have seen, right? When you're assessing different countries and their GDP levels, sometimes they'll rank, countries by economic output, and they'll either say market exchange rate or they'll say PPP in parentheses. And what's funny is a lot of economists, when they're doing that sort of thing, like to just rank countries globally, especially if they're going to do like a list, will use PPP by default. Like a lot of economists think in general, that's the more appropriate measure for a task like that. Okay. And so what does that mean? Just real quickly. The idea is, yes, you get like a basket of goods and services, and then you say, locally, you go around to Beijing or whatever other cities, and you figure out like how much do haircuts cost? How much does a meal at a restaurant cost? How much does whatever, a unit of natural gas cost, blah, 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 apartment rents, things like that. And you get a sense, okay, so how many yuan, do the people need to spend to get that? And then you construct a similar basket of goods and services in the United States and say, how many US dollars do Americans need to spend to get that? And then you weight the things appropriately, do whatever tricks you want to use, and then use that to try to come up with an exchange rate between dollars and yuan. And again, that's not going to be the same rate as the foreign exchange rate, because again, the arbitrage doesn't work. It's not that, if the apartment rents are higher or lower in Beijing versus New York, then you would just ship the apartment across the ocean, right? You see what I'm saying? Like that doesn't work. Whereas again, with internationally tradable goods, it does work. And so there, the prices do follow, the ratio of the sticker prices for yuan versus US dollars does match up with the market exchange rate in the Forex markets. Okay. But again, in general, that doesn't need to be the case. So if you use that technique to say, how should we weight US dollars versus yuan using purchasing power parity, then with that approach, China's economy has been bigger than the United States since 2014. And as of right now, it's about 1.4 times the size. Okay, so again, using market exchange rates, the US economy right now is about 50% bigger. But if you use purchasing power parity, China's economy right now is 40% bigger than the US. Okay. This was also ironic back when right-wing conservative types were accusing the Chinese government of currency manipulation. You may remember that. I think that was big like in the mid-2000s was when that claim was really going around, because what was happening is for a period there, the Chinese government was accumulating U.S. treasuries. And so the accusation was, they're taking their yuan and going and buying U.S. dollars with it, and then going and buying treasuries with the dollars. And so they're artificially making their currency weaker vis-a-vis the dollar. And so that's how they're promoting their exports. And that's not fair. That's currency manipulation, right? Whatever you think of those accusations, my point is, if you thought they were artificially weakening the yuan, then that was artificially making the U.S. economy bigger if you were using the market exchange rate technique, right? Because in other words, GDP measured in the local currencies is whatever it is. And so to then go from one to the other and say, well, how do we make USD versus yuan on an equal footing if you're using the foreign exchange rate while you're claiming, the Chinese authorities are manipulating it and they're making the dollar artificially strong. And that's why we can't export, because they're making our currency artificially stronger than it should be. Okay, but then that means, so in reality, the Chinese economy is bigger, or not necessarily like overall, but it's bigger than it appears to be, right? If you thought that. Okay. Either way, whichever one you think is appropriate, or maybe you think it's a blend, in which case maybe you're going to say, maybe they're about even right now. Either way, the growth rate China's growing right now about twice as fast as the US. Right. So specifically, the US GDP growth is like 2.1%, whereas China's is 4.2. You know, I'm rounding, but right. So it's literally double. So whatever you think about the correct way to assess the two, for the foreseeable future, China is either going to solidify its or extend its lead, or it's going to catch up. All right. So on that front, there you go.